In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still and silence rests heavy in the air, the human soul often awakens. Between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., many find themselves stirred from sleep, not by noise or chaos, but by something deeper, an inner summons that cannot be ignored. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious does not sleep. It is always alive, speaking through symbols, images, and subtle movements of the psyche. To awaken in this liminal time is not merely a disruption of rest, but a moment of profound psychological significance. These hours represent the threshold between the conscious and unconscious, where the veil is thinnest and where spiritual and psychological insights often surface. In my lecture today, I will explore what it truly means to awaken at this sacred interval, why it happens, and the practices you can engage in to turn this seemingly inconvenient interruption into a powerful opportunity for self-discovery and transformation. Awakening during the early morning hours is an experience that has fascinated human beings for centuries, but from a Jungian perspective, it carries a depth of meaning that goes far beyond the surface. To find oneself suddenly awake between 3 and 5 in the morning is often unsettling because it interrupts the natural rhythm of rest. Yet Jung would remind us that such interruptions can rarely be dismissed as meaningless accidents. The unconscious is always active, always speaking in symbols, dreams, and subtle signals, and the psyche often communicates in ways that bypass the rational mind. Waking up at these hours can be seen as a kind of symbolic call, an invitation from the unconscious to attend to something that remains unresolved, or to recognize the presence of archetypal material moving within. It is as if the psyche chooses this quiet, vulnerable time when the distractions of the external world are absent, to whisper truths that cannot be ignored any longer. The unconscious, in Jung's view, is not just a storehouse of forgotten memories or repressed desires. It is the vast ocean beneath the surface of consciousness, containing the collective heritage of humanity, the archetypal patterns that shape our perceptions, and the energies that influence us, whether or not we are aware of them. To awaken in the still hours of the night is to suddenly encounter this ocean pressing against the shores of consciousness. The ego, which during the day is engaged in navigating the demands of reality, is at rest. In sleep it withdraws its guard, and the unconscious seizes the opportunity to make itself known. When this results in waking, it is rarely an accident. Rather, it is a sign that the psyche demands recognition, that there are matters that cannot be ignored or suppressed any longer. This awakening can manifest as anxiety, a racing heart, or an inexplicable restlessness, and yet behind these symptoms lies meaning. The archetypes, those universal symbols Jung identified in myths, dreams, and human behavior, may be stirring. The archetype of the shadow, for example, may bring forth elements of the self that the ego rejects, forcing awareness of unacknowledged anger, fear, or envy. The archetype of the anima or animus may present itself, calling attention to neglected inner qualities, aspects of our masculine or feminine energies that need balance and integration. The self, the central archetype of wholeness, may be beckoning through such an awakening, urging us to step closer to individuation. to the fuller realization of our unique nature. To wake up in the deep night, then may be nothing less than a summons to dialogue with these hidden powers. From a symbolic perspective, 3 in the morning is not just any hour. Many traditions consider it a mystical time, a threshold between night and dawn, when the ordinary structures of consciousness are weakest. Jung, who had a deep interest in alchemy and spiritual traditions, would recognize the archetypal significance of such an hour. It is a liminal space, a borderland between 2 states, night and day, unconscious and conscious, death and rebirth. To awaken here is to be caught in the tension of opposites, which Jung saw as the source of psychic energy and transformation. The psyche wakes the individual precisely at this moment to force them into confrontation with this tension, to bring awareness of unresolved conflicts that must be integrated if growth is to occur. The experience of waking between 3 and 5 may point towards specific unresolved conflicts. It could be the result of anxiety that has not been properly acknowledged in waking life, worries that are repressed but surface when defenses are down. It may be grief that has not been processed, emotions that the ego has avoided during the day, but which demand recognition when silence and solitude prevail. It may be connected to deep spiritual hunger, the longing for meaning that cannot be satisfied by external accomplishments, but requires inner attention. The unconscious does not simply disturb sleep without reason. It chooses this vulnerable time because it is when we are least distracted and most open to listening. In many cases, Jungian analysis would suggest that these awakenings reflect a deeper archetypal drama. Perhaps the hero archetype is stirring, demanding that the individual confront challenges they have avoided. Perhaps the wise old man or woman is presenting itself in dreams or images, trying to guide the ego toward insight. Perhaps the shadow is intruding, reminding the individual of the parts of themselves they would rather forget. Each of these archetypes carries energy, and when ignored, that energy builds until it forces its way into consciousness. Waking in the middle of the night may therefore be understood as the psyche's way of breaking through resistance, forcing an encounter with material that must be acknowledged if the individual is to continue growing. Jung often spoke of the importance of symbols and the way the unconscious communicates through them. Waking at these specific hours may itself be symbolic. The early morning hours before the rising of the sun represent a kind of psychic darkness, but also the promise of renewal. It is in the darkness that transformation takes place, just as seeds germinate in the soil before breaking into the light. To be awakened in these hours is to be drawn into this symbolic process, to be reminded that before rebirth, there must be confrontation with darkness. The unconscious may be using this symbolic hour to indicate that the individual is in a stage of psychological gestation, preparing for growth that requires first the integration of shadow material or the recognition of hidden truths. From a psychological standpoint, it is tempting to reduce such awakenings to physical causes, disrupted sleep cycles, stress hormones, or biological rhythms. While these may play a role, Jung would urge us not to stop there. For him, every symptom is also a symbol, a message from the psyche. To ignore the symbolic dimension is to miss the deeper meaning of the experience. Stress itself can be symbolic, pointing to imbalances in life, conflicts between inner desires and outer demands. The body participates in the language of the unconscious, and waking up at a particular hour may reflect not only biological rhythms, but also psychic ones, cycles of transformation that follow their own mysterious timing. Consider also the possibility of synchronicity, Jung's concept of meaningful coincidence. To repeatedly wake at the same hour may not be random, but a synchronistic event linking inner experience with an outer pattern. The repeated timing may carry a symbolic meaning related to numbers or to the sequence of the night. 3 in the morning, for instance, may resonate with the archetype of the Trinity, with themes of unity, balance, or spiritual completion. The unconscious may choose this hour not arbitrarily, but because it resonates with the symbolic content of the individual's inner journey. By recognizing this, the individual can begin to see waking at these hours not as a curse, but as a meaningful message from the deeper self. In Jung's model of individuation, the journey toward wholeness requires continual dialogue with the unconscious. Waking in the early hours is one such opportunity, a direct summons to engage. Rather than resisting it, one may approach it with curiosity, asking what the unconscious seeks to reveal. This can be done through journaling immediately upon waking, recording images, feelings, or thoughts that arise. It can be done through active imagination, engaging with the figures or sensations that surface in those moments. It can even be done through prayer or meditation, not in a religious sense necessarily, but as a way of opening to the deeper layers of the psyche. The key is to recognize that these awakenings are not meaningless disturbances, but opportunities for connection with the unconscious. The unresolved conflicts that surface at this time are not to be feared, but embraced as guides. The unconscious seeks integration, not destruction. Its core is often uncomfortable because it demands honesty. It demands that the ego admit what it has tried to suppress. Yet by answering this call, by attending to what arises in those hours, the individual can move closer to wholeness. Each awakening is therefore both a challenge and a gift, a reminder that the psyche is alive, that it seeks growth, and that it will use even the silence of the night to bring us into dialogue with ourselves. The significance of the 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. interval lies not only in its placement on the clock, but in its psychological and symbolic power. In Jungian terms, these hours form what might be called a liminal space, a threshold between worlds. The ego, tired and unguarded, loosens its grip, and the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious thins. This thinning is crucial because it allows material from the depths of the psyche to rise more readily into awareness, offering access to realms of intuition, dream content, and hidden aspects of the self that are often inaccessible in the noise and distraction of daily life. To awaken during these hours is to be thrust into that threshold, confronted with images, feelings, and insights that demand recognition. Jung often stressed that transformation occurs in the tension between opposites. And here, between night and dawn, the psyche presents itself with striking clarity. The interval between 3 and 5 carries significance in many spiritual and cultural traditions as a sacred time, sometimes called the hour of the soul or the veil hour, when the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds is most permeable. For Jung, who studied myths, religions, and alchemical texts, this universality would not be coincidence, but evidence of archetypal truth. Archetypes express themselves across cultures, appearing in rituals, symbols, and timings that humanity has intuitively recognized. To consistently wake in this window is to find oneself caught in the archetypal rhythm, as if some deeper intelligence of the psyche is aligning itself with universal patterns of transition and transformation. Such awakenings must therefore be read not as accidents, but as invitations to pay attention to what is surfacing in the psyche. When the ego relaxes its defenses, the unconscious seizes the opportunity to communicate, and the material that rises often takes the form of symbols. In dreams, which are abundant in this interval, symbols emerge that may later be forgotten by morning consciousness. But when waking occurs, in the midst of such a process, fragments of these symbols can still be grasped. A person may wake with a vivid image, a phrase echoing in the mind, or an intense emotion that has no obvious source. These fragments are not trivial. They are messages from the unconscious, condensed forms of meaning that, if reflected upon, can reveal truths about one's inner state. To wake and dismiss them as random is to miss the very reason the psyche has disturbed sleep. To linger with them, record them, and contemplate them is to engage with the unconscious in its own symbolic language. This liminal time is also uniquely suited to intuition. Jung distinguished between sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition as psychological functions, with intuition being the least bound by rational structures. In the early morning hours, when rational faculties are subdued and external demands are absent, intuition flows more freely. Insights may surface that seem irrational, but carry deep resonance, leading to sudden clarity about relationships, choices, or unresolved conflicts. Many creative figures throughout history have described receiving their most profound insights at night or upon waking before dawn. Moments when they were still suspended between sleep and wakefulness. Jung would regard these as moments when the unconscious breaks through, bypassing the rigidities of logical thought to deliver a more holistic vision of truth. Hidden aspects of the self often emerge during these hours as well. The shadow, the repository of traits and impulses the ego denies, can press closer to consciousness, making itself felt in anxiety, restlessness, or disturbing thoughts. Yet rather than being a sign of pathology, such intrusions can be understood as opportunities for integration. To acknowledge the shadow is to reclaim parts of the psyche that have been repressed, bringing greater wholeness. Similarly, the anima or animus, the inner feminine in men or inner masculine in women, may appear in dreams or fantasies during this interval, revealing qualities that are needed for balance. These encounters are easier to ignore during the day, when distractions abound, but in the stark quiet of early morning, they present themselves with undeniable intensity. The psyche chooses this time precisely because it cannot be overlooked. There is also the archetype of the self, the organizing center of the psyche, which often makes itself known in moments of great transition or crisis. Waking in these early hours may be a sign that the self is drawing attention, urging the individual toward the process of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming whole. The self often communicates through numinous experiences, feelings of awe, mystery, significance that transcend ordinary emotion. To wake at these hours with a sense of being called, watched, or drawn inward is not uncommon, and Jung would interpret such experiences as encounters with the self, an archetype that both guides and transcends the ego. These moments should not be dismissed as oddities, but honored as signals of deeper transformation underway. The physiological quiet of these hours also plays a role in their psychological power. The body is at its lowest ebb, with temperature and metabolic activity reduced, leaving the psyche in a state of heightened vulnerability. This vulnerability is not weakness, but openness, a receptivity that allows the unconscious to impress itself more strongly upon awareness. The stillness of the external world mirrors this state, creating an atmosphere in which inner voices are easier to hear. Jung would note the synchronicity between outer and inner conditions. The silence of the world outside corresponds to the silence of the ego's defenses, making possible a meeting between conscious and unconscious that rarely occurs during waking hours. From the standpoint of dreams, the interval between 3 and 5 is significant because it coincides with the later cycles of REM sleep when dreaming is most intense. Dreams in this phase are often complex, layered, and emotionally charged, carrying material from both the personal and collective unconscious. To wake during or just after such a dream is to be given direct access to this material before it slips away into forgetfulness. Jung encouraged paying careful attention to dreams as guides to the unconscious, and waking in this interval provides a natural opportunity to record and reflect on them. The psyche, in effect, wakes the dreamer so that the message will not be lost. The thinness of ego boundaries at this time also explains why many report paranormal or spiritual experiences during these hours. Jung himself was open to the reality of phenomena that could not be fully explained by rational science, describing them as expressions of the psyche's autonomy and its participation in a larger, mysterious reality. Whether interpreted as spiritual visitation or psychological projection, the experiences are meaningful because they reveal the psyche's capacity to connect to realms beyond ordinary perception. For Jung, the question is not whether such phenomena are objectively real, but what they signify symbolically. A sense of presence in the room, a vivid dream of a deceased loved one, or a sudden intuition about one's path. All are manifestations of the unconscious reaching across the thinning veil. This period can also be described as an archetypal encounter with death and rebirth. Night represents death, dissolution, and unconsciousness, while dawn symbolizes rebirth, renewal, and consciousness. To wake in the hours just before dawn is to be caught in the transitional space, a symbolic death of old patterns before the light of new awareness. Jung saw individuation as a continual process of death and rebirth, the shedding of outdated identifications, and the emergence of new wholeness. Thus, waking in this liminal time may reflect precisely this process, as the psyche signals that the individual is undergoing a transition, shedding old forms and preparing for renewal. The power of the 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. interval lies in its ability to disrupt complacency. During the day, one can easily avoid uncomfortable truths, drown them out with business, or deny them with rationalizations. But in the early morning, when silence reigns, avoidance is more difficult. The unconscious chooses this time to present what must be faced. It may bring unresolved conflicts to the surface, not to torment, but to heal. It may stir emotions long buried, not to overwhelm, but to integrate. It may reveal images and symbols that seem strange, but which, if engaged with, lead to greater self-knowledge. The liminal nature of this interval ensures that the psyche cannot be ignored, because the thinning of boundaries makes its presence undeniable. Jung often emphasized that the unconscious seeks not destruction, but balance. Its messages may be disruptive, even frightening, but their purpose is to restore wholeness. Waking between 3 and 5 can therefore be reframed as a gift, however unsettling. It is a call to engage with the unconscious, to recognize the material that surfaces and to use it as fuel for individuation. By recording dreams, attending to emotions, and reflecting on symbols, one can turn this disturbance into an opportunity for growth. Rather than resisting the wakefulness, one can ask what it signifies, what the psyche is trying to reveal. In this way, the liminal space becomes a threshold to transformation, and the darkness of night becomes the womb of new awareness. Practical steps and Jungian practices to engage during the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning are not about forcing sleep to return at all costs, but about recognizing the opportunity that these moments present. From a Jungian perspective, the unconscious is never silent. It speaks in dreams, symbols, and emotional stirrings. And when it wakes us in these early hours, it is signaling a need for dialogue. Rather than treating this disruption as meaningless, one can approach it with intentional practices that allow the unconscious to express itself, creating a bridge between hidden inner processes and conscious awareness. These practices are not rigid techniques, but invitations to listen, to observe, and to participate in the symbolic language of the psyche, transforming restlessness into growth and making the early morning a sacred space for individuation. One of the most valuable practices during these hours is journaling. The psyche is closest to its dream material at this time, and images, fragments of dreams, or sudden feelings often linger. By writing them down immediately, without editing or judgment, one captures the raw material of the unconscious before it slips back into oblivion. Jung himself emphasized the importance of engaging with dreams and symbols, for they reveal what the conscious mind overlooks. A dream fragment written at 4 in the morning may later reveal profound insight into a conflict, a hidden desire, or an archetypal theme unfolding in life. Journaling also grounds the experience, giving form to the otherwise fleeting whispers of the unconscious, and over time patterns emerge that show the psyche's ongoing dialogue. The act of writing transforms vague restlessness into meaningful communication. Another central Jungian practice suited to these hours is active imagination. This is not simply daydreaming, but a disciplined dialogue with images, feelings, or figures that arise from the unconscious. Upon waking at 3 or 4 in the morning, one may find a particular image from a dream still vivid, or a certain mood lingering without explanation. Instead of dismissing it, one can close the eyes again and consciously engage with it, allowing the image to unfold, speaking to it, asking what it represents, and listening for its response. In this practice, the unconscious is treated as an active partner with its own autonomy and voice. Jung described active imagination as a way of giving the unconscious a stage to play out its drama, enabling the ego to integrate material that would otherwise remain foreign. At these hours, when the ego is thin and receptive, active imagination becomes particularly potent, offering direct access to archetypal energies. Breath awareness and contemplative stillness also hold immense value. To wake at such a time often brings anxiety or frustration, but bringing attention to the breath creates a bridge to calm and receptivity. Slow, deliberate breathing centers the body and quiets the racing mind, allowing one to become a witness rather than a captive of restlessness. In Jungian terms, this stillness creates space for the unconscious to speak without the interference of the ego's chatter. It can also be an opportunity for meditation, not necessarily in a formal sense, but as an openness to whatever arises. The silence of the early morning, paired with attentive breathing, fosters a kind of inner listening that is rare in the daylight hours. In this way, the disruption of sleep becomes an invitation to presence, an entry into communion with deeper layers of the self. Reflection on synchronicities is another practice that aligns with Jung's understanding of meaningful coincidence. Waking consistently at the same hour, or waking with certain repeating thoughts, can be viewed not as random events, but as synchronistic signals. Writing them down, reflecting on their possible meanings, and noticing how they connect to daily life allows one to perceive the guidance of the unconscious in a more integrated way. Feng, synchronicities were evidence of the unity between inner and outer realities, a patterning that reveals meaning beyond causality. To wake at 3 every night may seem irritating until one asks why that hour, why that pattern, and how it corresponds to the themes present in one's life. The very act of reflecting in this way opens the door to insights that the unconscious is pressing to reveal. But dream work becomes especially significant in these hours. Often waking occurs just after a powerful dream, and the fragments remain alive in memory. By writing down every detail, however small, one can later analyze the dream for archetypal themes, personal associations, and symbolic meaning. Dreams are not puzzles with single solutions, but living narratives that express the psyche's current state. One may dream of water, which in Jungian interpretation often symbolizes the unconscious itself, or of journeys, which may symbolize the path of individuation. Recording and reflecting on these dreams when waking at 3 or 4 ensures that their messages are not lost to the forgetfulness of daylight. Over time, one begins to see how the unconscious uses dreams to guide, challenge, and heal. Another practical step is creative expression. The hours between 3 and 5, while often lonely, can also be fertile for creativity. Jung recognized the therapeutic value of art, sculpture, and writing in giving shape to unconscious material, to rise quietly and sketch an image that came from a dream, to paint colors that reflect one's mood, or to write freely without judgment allows the unconscious to express itself through symbolic form. These creations are not meant for aesthetic judgment, but for personal dialogue. They become mirrors of the psyche, revealing patterns and truths that words alone cannot capture. Many have found that the inspiration of these hours carries a rawness and authenticity that daytime expression lacks, as if the unconscious lends its own energy to the creative act. Prayer or spiritual dialogue, too, can serve as a practice in these hours, even for those not aligned with a particular religion. To wake in the stillness of night often stirs feelings of vulnerability, and directing those feelings toward a higher reality or inner guide can be profoundly grounding. Distinguished between dogmatic religion and the direct experience of the numinous, the latter being encounters with the sacred that transform the psyche. To use these hours to pray, to meditate on symbols, or to open oneself to the numinous is to allow the unconscious to connect with its archetypal depths, particularly the archetype of the self. This becomes not an act of dogma, but of direct engagement with the forces that shape the soul. Body awareness can also be integrated. The unconscious communicates not only through dreams and symbols, but through the body itself. Waking at 3 in the morning may be accompanied by tightness in the chest, knots in the stomach, or restlessness in the limbs. Instead of ignoring these sensations, one can bring attention to them, asking what they represent emotionally or symbolically. The body, in Jung's view, is not separate from the psyche, but part of its expression. By attending to physical sensations, one may uncover the psychic tension behind them, perhaps unexpressed grief, suppressed anger, or longing for connection. Acknowledging these embodied messages is another way of giving the unconscious a voice. It is also possible to practice visualization during these hours. One might imagine descending into a cave, entering a forest, or approaching a figure who waits to speak. Such symbolic journeys can be guided by intuition, allowing images to arise spontaneously rather than being forced. Jung often drew parallels between these inner journeys and the myths of descent found in many cultures, such as Inanna's descent into the underworld or Christ's harrowing of hell. To engage in visualization at this liminal time is to consciously participate in the archetypal descent into the unconscious, encountering the symbols and figures that dwell there. These encounters, though sometimes unsettling, provide insight and healing when approached with openness. For those pursuing individuation, the key is to treat these hours not as intrusions, but as thresholds. Individuation requires a continual dialogue between the conscious ego and the unconscious, and the early morning hours provide a natural stage for this dialogue. Practical steps like journaling, active imagination, breath awareness, synchronicity reflection, dream work, creative expression, prayer, body awareness, and visualization are not techniques in isolation, but threads in a tapestry of dialogue. Each gives form to the unconscious, each builds relationship with the deeper self, and each turns restlessness into transformation. Over time, engaging in these practices cultivates a sensitivity to the psyche's language, allowing one to respond to its calls with curiosity rather than fear. These hours can also be framed as a daily ritual, an initiation repeated night after night, to awaken in the silence, to engage with the unconscious intentionally, and to return to rest with a sense of dialogue completed transforms the experience of insomnia into a sacred practice. In Jungian thought, ritual is vital for integrating archetypal energies, and by making a ritual of these early hours, one honors the psyche's rhythms rather than fighting against them. This transforms not only the experience of waking at night, but the trajectory of one's psychological growth, as the unconscious no longer needs to shout, but finds itself welcomed into awareness.